All right, and we're at 31 participants. So we'll just wait a few more minutes and then we can go ahead and get started.
Sure.
Still at 31. Oh, and then Janet, you already have a comment in the Q&A. Ken H. Used to teach with Todd W. at Hudson. And now Todd is outside San Francisco and says, I'm so appreciative of you sharing your story and allowing me to include some of my students.
Very nice.
All right, we'll just give it a few more minutes. Let's see, we're at 33. And we're also recording the session. So if for some reason something happens with Facebook Live, we will have a recording that we can share. All right, Janet, so it's 5 after 7. I feel like we can go ahead and get started, or I can at least start introducing you. Thank you so much, Janet, for joining us this evening. Janet would like us to let you all know in the audience that this program is supported in part by a grant from the Wilmington Cultural Council, a local agency which is supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a state agency. We would also like to thank Wilmington High School teacher Michael Jones for so generously sharing the opportunity for this program with us and connecting the library community with Janet. So thank you, Mr. Jones. So just before I introduce Janet and she goes into her presentation for all of our participants in the webinar, you will see at the bottom of your screen that you have a chat box and a Q&A box. So if you have a general comment like perhaps you're experiencing a problem with your audio or video, you can leave me a note there. And we, luckily, our wonderful tech librarian, Brad, is here to help with any of that kind of troubleshooting. So thank you so much, Brad, and also Aaron, who is watching from home, our adult services librarian. So we can help you there. But if you have a question that you would like Janet to answer at the end of her presentation, please put it in the Q&A box and I will read those questions out for Janet at the end so she can answer your questions. All right, so I will briefly introduce Janet and then we'll go ahead and get started. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Janet Singer Applefield, a survivor of the Holocaust. Her presentation raises awareness and understanding of the dangers of prejudice and encourages youth and adults to stand up to any kind of discrimination and injustice. Janet was only 4 years old when World War II began with the German invasion of Poland. She will talk about her experiences from pre-war years to living in Nazi-occupied Poland to the end of World War II, to freedom and coming to the United States in March 1947. Janet earned her Master's of Social Work at Boston University. As a clinical social worker, she has counseled a variety of patients from juvenile offenders convicted of hate crimes to geriatric populations. She currently provides psychotherapy and behavioral management services to nursing home patients. She has 3 children and 5 grandchildren and lives outside Boston, Massachusetts.
Thank you, Brittany. Hello, everybody. So I speak to thousands of students and adults every year, and I tell the story of how I survived the Holocaust. The Holocaust was the most heinous and vicious crime in the history of mankind. As a result of World War II, between 50 million and 60 million people were killed. 6 million Jewish people were murdered because the Nazis had a particular hatred against Jewish people and they were determined to destroy all Jews of Europe. 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered. Only 11% survived, and I was one of those very lucky children. In my speaking, I hope to inspire greater awareness and understanding of the dangers of prejudice and racism. Today, I speak to you. As I speak to you, my talk will be even more impassioned because I am upset. I'm very upset. I feel sadness, disappointment, and an outrage due to the racism, inequality, and injustice we're seeing in America today. What is happening before our very own eyes is extremely upsetting. It's hurting my heart. The images of George Floyd and other Black men being killed are very difficult to look at. When we teach history, it's our hope and expectation that we will learn important lessons so that we will not repeat the mistakes from the past. Sadly, we have not learned those lessons. We must not only fight the actions of violent people, but also we must motivate the good people into action. Many of my family members were murdered due to discrimination and simply because of their religious beliefs. That is why I feel so passionate about sharing with you my story. Today, I plead with you to make a commitment to make a difference. I too accept the challenge and pledge to be an instrument of change. What I find so frightening and disheartening is that there's so many similarities of how events unfolded in Europe before World War II. So I want to tell you about myself and what happened to me and my family. So I was born in Krakow, Poland, and I lived with my mother, baby sister, in a little town 50 miles south of the city of Krakow. I lived there with extended family, grandparents, cousins, aunts, uncles. I remember the first few years of my life because they were so good and so happy. By the way, my appearance had a lot to do with my survival because I looked like a typical Aryan child. Aryan or Aryanism was a doctrine that was developed by the Nazis. They were trying to develop a master race and they thought that people should have certain appearance. And I certainly did have that appearance because of my, my coloring, my blonde hair and light skin and certain features. Also, my name was changed 3 different times during the war. I remember I had an uncle who had a motorcycle with a little sidecar. He used to put me in there, take me for rides, take me to the candy store. I remember the holidays, preparing with my mother and my grandmother. Well, this wonderful few years of my life ended very abruptly. September 1st, 1939, when the war broke out. I was just 4 years old. My father told me he was awake at 5 o'clock in the morning. He heard explosions. He turned on the radio and he heard the announcer say that Poland was attacked. The first few days of the war were very confusing and chaotic. People didn't know what to do or where to go. My father sent me and my mother, my baby sister, to my other grandparents' home. When we arrived there, everybody was packing up their belongings and running away from the fighting, heading eastward toward Russia. My grandfather packed some of our things onto a horse and wagon, and we started to drive out of town. I remember that ride. I was just 4 years old, but I do remember because it was so frightening. There were planes overhead shooting at us. We had to jump off the wagon and we had to hide in a ditch and wait till the shooting stopped. I remember seeing an airplane that was burnt and it shot down and it exploded. Sometimes roads and bridges would be out and we had to travel across the river on foot. And after several days, or actually around 2 weeks, we arrived at our destination. In the meantime, my father and my uncles tried to join the Polish army to fight the Germans, but Poland was defeated in 1 month's time. When that happened, my father and my uncles joined this caravan of people that was constantly streaming out of Poland into Russia. There were approximately 200,000 Polish nationals that crossed the border. When my father first arrived, he had no idea where we were. Communication in those days was difficult. Not too many people had telephones, and of course there were no cell phones. My father advertised in the newspaper looking for us, and in time he was able to find us. Life in Russia was extremely difficult. There was shortage of food, shortage of work. And there was an announcement made that any men who needed a job should report at the town hall. Well, my 2 uncles decided to go, but my father wasn't feeling well that day, so he didn't go. When they arrived there, there was a marching band playing. They were told to sing nationalistic songs, and then they were marched to a nearby ravine. They were told to take off their clothes, and they were shot into the ravine. Another very tragic thing happened. My baby sister got very sick. She contracted diphtheria. Of course, it was wartime, so there was no treatment, and my baby sister died. She was just 18 months old. After we were in Russia for several months, there was an order issued that all these Polish nationals, in order to be allowed to stay and work, had to take out Russian citizenship. Well, my parents were afraid to do that. Their thinking was that when the war would be over, they wouldn't be able to go back to Poland and get their property back. So we returned back to Poland. My grandparents stayed, and 1 aunt and uncle stayed. And the people who stayed, they were put onto trains and sent off to Siberia. Siberia is a region of Russia where the conditions and the weather is very harsh, and they were sent to slave labor camps. My grandmother died there. When we arrived back in our town, all the Jewish people were forced to live in a ghetto. A ghetto was a neighborhood that the Nazis selected. They made all the people who lived there move out and all the Jewish people move in. The ghettos in big cities had high cement walls with barbed wire and guarded entrances. This ghetto was open. It didn't have any walls around it. We lived in a little town. All the Jewish people were forced to wear armbands to identify themselves as Jews. Every day there were roundups of people. They were either taken to a local cemetery and shot, and some people were sent off to slave labor camps. My parents, well, one time I remember the Gestapo, the secret police, came to our apartment. They were searching for valuables, money, jewelry, furs, art. They took whatever they wanted. My parents were afraid because he heard that the Gestapo, the secret police, was looking for my father. So they decided that we would try to escape. So one night we left the ghetto, we took off our armbands and we went to the train station. Train stations were notoriously dangerous because that's where frequently the plainclothes Gestapo would be. But we managed to take a train and we ended up in another town where my mother had relatives. When we arrived there, it was a very similar situation because the Nazis were so well organized. My parents once again thought we would try to escape. So one night, my father got a horse and wagon. It was August 1942, very bright night. The moon was out. We started to drive out of town, but we did not get very far when suddenly in the distance, we saw Polish police approaching on horseback. We jumped off the wagon and we started to run. You might wonder, why would we be afraid of the Polish police? The reason for that was that Poland was a very anti-Semitic country. They were very prejudiced against Jews. And often the Polish police would cooperate and collaborate with the Nazis. So we started to run and we ended up in some fields where potato plants were growing. We tried to hide, but of course, potato plants are short. So it was very soon that they found us, they beat us up and they made us return. And at that point, my parents realized that there was nowhere to go, no place to hide, no place to run. They were desperately trying to find someone who'd be willing to take me and hide me. They were able to convince a woman. Her name was Maria. Maria was a nanny to one of my cousins. They pleaded with Maria to take me, and she agreed. So one day my parents sat me down and explained that I was going to go with Maria, and that I should be good, I should listen to her, and that we would be reunited soon. So I left with her. I left with her, and in the meantime, my parents had gotten a notice that they had 3 days to report at a area outside of Krakow. They made another decision. They decided they would separate from each other. Their thinking was, if they separated, maybe, just maybe one of them would survive. So they went to this place, and when they arrived, there were approximately 12,000 people congregated in this very large meadow. It was August, so it was very hot. There was no water, there was no food, there was no place for them to sleep. And then there was a selection. A selection meant that the SS officers would make a decision who would live and who would die. Approximately 1,000 men were selected for slave labor. My father was one of those men. The rest of the people were put into 53 boxcars marked with the letter B. Between 120 and 150 people were put into each boxcar. It was so crowded that they couldn't sit or lie down. They had to stand for 5 days. They were sent to the concentration camp called Belzec on the eastern front of Poland. When they arrived, some people were already dead because the floors of the boxcars were sprinkled with a white disinfectant, and when it got wet, it gave off toxic fumes. They took the people off the train and they took them to the gas chamber. It took only 3 hours from the time they were taken off the train to when they were killed. This camp existed only 6 months, and in that period of time, 600,000 people were murdered. Only 2 people survived this camp. My mother, my grandmother, my aunts, my cousins, many of my family members were victims of that camp. When the Nazis realized or learned how to kill more efficiently, they burned this camp to the ground. Today there's a monument and a museum there. And then they started to send people to Auschwitz, a concentration camp called Auschwitz. So my father was sent to the Krakow ghetto. Every morning at 5 a.m, he and other prisoners were marched to a local cable factory. My father worked on an assembly line making electrical cables. He told me the only reason he wanted to live was knowing that he gave me away and he had to find me when the war would be over. While my father was still living in the ghetto, the Nazis were building the concentration camp called Płaszów on the outskirts of the city of Krakow. And when that camp was completed, the Krakow ghetto was liquidated and my father went to live in the concentration camp. In the meantime, I went with Maria. Maria had an apartment in the city. And I remember so well being in that apartment because there were times when she would go out in the evening and leave me alone. I was really scared. I was locked into a pitch black apartment because there was no electricity. And I couldn't open the door and I was terrified. One day there was a knock on the door. Maria opened the door and there was an SS officer standing there. He said, "I have orders to search your apartment to see if you're hiding any Jews." He barged in, he looked under all the furniture, he turned some of the furniture over. He came up to me, held up my braid. He wanted to know who I was. Maria said that I was her niece. She was taking care of me because her sister was sick. He accepted her story and he turned around and he left. And to this day, I remember what he looked like. He was blonde, he had blue eyes, and he was wearing black leather boots that came up to his knees. And I could hear the clicking of his heels as he went down the steps. Now, my father knew that he had to make different arrangements for me because Maria said she couldn't keep me indefinitely because it was a very dangerous thing she was doing. He was able to contact a cousin who was living on falsified Polish papers. And one day, my care was transferred from Maria to my cousin. Now, my cousin had a Polish identity. Her Polish name was Halina Bałkowska. And she was able to obtain a birth certificate from a Catholic priest of a little Polish Catholic girl that died. And her name was Krystyna Antoszkiewicz. And that became my new name. I became this little girl, this Krystyna Antoszkiewicz. Her nickname was Krysia, and now I was Krysia. So my name was changed 3 different times. I was not born Janet, I was born Gustava. And later I got my name Janet. During the war, I was Krystyna or Krysia. My cousin was young, just 19 years old. There would be times when we would take the trolley car in the city, and she would always tell me to be quiet, not to speak, because Polish people were forbidden to sit in the front part of the trolley. They had to sit in the back. The front was reserved for Germans. But because she was brazen and confident and she spoke German fluently, she would tell me to be quiet so we would be able to sit in the front. We lived in another little town outside of the city of Krakow. She was very mean to me. She used to beat me with a fireplace poker. And when I cried for my mother, she would say, "Your mother is dead. She's never coming back for you." I used to have to take these very heavy boxes to the post office. They were so big and heavy, I could barely carry them. And I didn't know what was in those boxes until much later. So my cousin had a Polish boyfriend, and he used to come and visit with her. He had a shoe factory, but behind the shoe factory, they were making ammunition. So inside those boots, those boxes were shoes and boots, and inside the shoes and boots were hand grenades, guns, bullets. And I was mailing these boxes to different resistance groups because I believe my cousin was in the Polish resistance. Sometimes my cousin would go out for the whole day. She would take me outside. I would have to sit on the front stoop, cold and hungry, and she would be gone all day. There was a nice lady who lived next door. Her name was Janina. And I remember when my fingers were so badly injured, Janina made bandages for my fingers, and eventually all my nails fell off, but she made bandages. And I remember when I would be hungry, she would give me a little piece of bread to eat, and sometimes she would let me play with her baby. One day, my cousin said she was going to the city to meet her boyfriend, and she took me with her. When we arrived in Krakow, she took me into a church, and she told me to sit and wait for her while she was going across the street to meet her boyfriend in a cafe. I sat and I waited and waited and waited. She never came back for me. So finally, I walked out of the church. It was late afternoon. I saw that the whole street was cordoned off. I crossed the street. I overheard people, there were groups of people standing there, and I overheard them say that the cafe was raided by the Gestapo, and now everybody was gone from the cafe. So here I was, 7 years old, walking up and down the street, crying. I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, a woman came up to me and very quickly put me under her coat. And I said, "Could you please take me to the bus? I was going to go back to my village." And she said, no, you're too little. She took me into the building, the same building where the cafe was, upstairs to the apartment of the woman by the name of Alicia Goem. Alicia asked me, "Who are you? What happened? Where are you from?" And I explained that my parents were killed in a bombing raid, and I was living with my cousin, and now she was gone. Alicia said I could stay there, but actually I couldn't stay in that particular apartment for 3 reasons. One was that Alicia's mother, who also had an apartment in the building, was very active in the Polish resistance. And in her apartment, she ran a hospital. She had shortwave radios. She had ammunition. Another reason was that there was an SS officer living in the building. And the third reason was that when the Gestapo made an arrest, they always returned for the second time. So they were afraid to keep me there. So the oldest son, Staszek, took me, and we walked for several miles, and we came to a farm that was owned and operated by the Catholic Church. And Alicia's brother-in-law was the administrator of that farm. So I remained on the farm. I remember one time we had slaughtered a pig, and we were cutting up the carcass in the kitchen. Polish people were forbidden to kill animals for their own consumption. That was strictly reserved for the Germans. But they had just slaughtered the pig, and suddenly there was a knock on the door. Someone came to tell us that the Gestapo was on the way. It was not unusual for them to come. They would just drop in anytime to pick up provisions, butter, cheese, eggs. So very quickly, we cleaned everything up and we hid everything in the attic and we waited. And they came. And when they came, I was really scared because I was always afraid of uniforms. I don't know what made me do this, because I said, "Give them vodka." So they started to drink, and then I started to sing and dance. So they were drinking and laughing at me, or somewhat amused, and finally they left. My father told me of an incident that happened to him. One night, in the middle of the night, he had to use the bathroom, which was outside. He found a cigarette stub and he was smoking. A guard saw him and shot him in the face. The bullet lodged under my father's cheekbone and just stopped right there. He couldn't get any medical treatment, so that bullet had to stay there. When the Nazis realized that they were losing the war, they wanted to destroy any evidence. So they had all the prisoners dig up the very shallow graves all around this camp. There were thousands of bodies buried in shallow graves. People died of starvation, diseases, or simply because they were shot. And so my father's job was to dig up the bodies, put them in a big pile and burn them. He said he couldn't get the smell out of his nostrils for years. He could smell the burning bones and flesh. When that job was completed, the prisoners, and my father included, they had to burn, they burned the camp. The Nazis burned the camp to the ground. Today, there's just a monument standing there. So we were liberated by the Russians. And I remember when the war was coming to an end, because it was very dangerous around the farm. They were fighting all around the farm, and we too had to use the outhouse. So we were risking our lives when we went outside. And it was finally decided that it was so dangerous that we left the farm and moved back to the city. I remember when there were air sirens sounding in the middle of the night, we had to get up. You know, everybody had a candle. We were in an apartment building, so everybody in the building was carrying a candle and walking down to the cellar. There was a dirt cellar, and there were benches all around the room, and we just sat there till another siren sounded to say that it was safe to go back upstairs. So when the war ended, my cousin's father found where I was, and he came to get me. I really didn't want to go with him because I was afraid of him, just the way I had been afraid of his daughter. But of course, the family didn't feel they had a right to keep me because he was my relative. So I left with him, but he didn't keep me very long. He turned me over to a refugee center in Krakow. So I was 10 years old when the war ended, and I was in this one big room with about 70 children like myself, some little older, some younger. Every day there were lists posted on the wall with names of survivors. Along came a woman, her name was Lena. Lena came every day looking at the list, searching for her daughter and husband and other family members. And she came across this room full of children, and she made a decision that she had to do something for the children. So in time, she was able to open 2 orphanages. I remember the night we left for the orphanage. We had to leave in the middle of the night because there were men and women picketing in front of the refugee center, carrying hateful slogans saying that we all should have been killed. So we climbed into the trucks. One of the trucks was for the children who had tuberculosis and other infectious diseases, because the Polish hospitals refused to take Jewish children. So we climbed into the trucks. They pulled tarpaulin covers over us. And I went to live in one of the orphanages in Zakopane. Only the older children were sent to public school. But every day the children came back. They were beaten up by the Polish children. Lena went to the school pleading with the principal and the teachers to protect the children, but they didn't. Lena was always afraid that our home would be attacked because the other orphanage was attacked 3 different times. And finally, it was so dangerous that they decided to close that orphanage. Those children came to live with us. And because Lena was so afraid that we would be attacked, she obtained ammunition. And the older children were trained in use of ammunition. One night, late at night, a Polish lady knocked on the door. She came to tell us that our home was going to be attacked. So the children took their positions on the terrace and the balcony and on the roof, and they waited. And in the middle of the night, Polish men came, they were on horseback, they were carrying fire torches and they were shooting, but the children were able to defend our home. One day, Lena went back to the refugee center to pick up some provisions, and she overheard a man asking about his daughter. And she said to him, "Can you describe what your daughter looks like?" And when he did, she said, "I think I have your child." She came back to the orphanage. She called me down to her office, and she told me, "I have wonderful news to tell you. Your father has survived and he's coming to see you." I will always remember the reunion with my dad, because when I first saw him, I was so scared of him. He looked like a skeleton. He was so emaciated. His clothes hung on him. He was kissing and hugging me and telling me he's going to take me away. I didn't want to go because for the first time I had friends, and Lena was our mother. We called her mother. My father was very sick. He couldn't take me right away, so he rented a room nearby. He got stronger. He gained weight. I would visit with him every day, and in time he was able to take me, and we went back to our town. We lived with several of my friends, my father's friends who survived. We lived in my grandparents' apartment above their store, but we weren't safe there because there were notes posted on the door saying we would be murdered. Several of my father's friends were murdered after the war. Young men driving in a car, they were ambushed and shot. My father went to the police chief asking for protection, and the police chief said all he could do is to give my father a gun. So my father slept with a gun, and it became pretty clear that it was too dangerous to stay there. So we moved back to Krakow, and it was a little safer in the city. But in time, he realized that we had no future in Poland. We were not welcome. It was dangerous. We couldn't get our property back. So he had two brothers. One brother was living in Palestine and the other brother was living in the United States. He came to me and asked me, where do you want to go? And I said, I want to go to America because I heard that money grew on trees. So of course it wasn't a simple matter as packing our bags and leaving. It took about 2 years to get the proper documents. We had distant relatives living in New Jersey who prepared these documents for us. And basically these papers stated that if my father couldn't support himself and support me, that they would take care of us so that we would never become a burden to this country and have to go on public assistance. So in March of 1947, my father and I came on a marine transport boat. It was very rough crossing because the Atlantic is storming in March. The trip took, I think, 14 days and everybody was seasick. It was pretty rough. I remember loving the vending machines and being able to put a nickel in and pulling out a Milky Way. I love Milky Ways. I still do. And in those days they were big. And then the other food I loved was red Jello. I had never seen red Jello before. So we settled in New Jersey, and my uncle took me to school. I was 11, almost 12 when I came. I was 10 when the war ended, and I was almost 12 when I came here. And my uncle took me to an elementary school. I had never gone to school. I knew how to read and write in Polish, but I didn't speak English. And right there in the school office, he said to me, what name do you want? You have to have an American name. So I hadn't given it any thought before this. And I thought for a little bit, like 30 seconds, and I came up with the name Jeanette because we had a cousin who was French. She lived in Paris, and she would visit in the summer, and she was beautiful and glamorous, and she had long red nails, and her name was Jeanette. And my uncle said, well, no, because in English it's Janet. So that's how I became Janet. And so I was put in a fifth, sixth grade combination grade in April, but by the end of school year in June, I was promoted to seventh grade, which was the correct grade for me. I remember especially my eighth grade because my 8th grade teacher always referred to me as that little foreign girl. Here I was trying to fit in, blend in, not stand out, but that's how she identified me. But I was very lucky because I had a wonderful group of girlfriends that kind of took me under their wing, socialized me, really helped me out. And I'm still friendly with some of them today. And so, I was a good student. I did well in high school. I was active. I was in French club, in school band, in what else did I do? I wrote for the school paper. I was in student government, and then I graduated and I went off to college. But at age 19, I got married. So in those days, young girls, young women married young. And I got married. I promised my parents I would finish college, and I kept my promise. It was very difficult. When I speak to only students, I always say, don't do it. 19 is too young. But I completed school and college. And later on, first I got my BA, and then later on I continued my education. I got my master's in social work. So today I have 3 children, 5 grandchildren, and I just stopped working mostly because of COVID. I'd been working part-time. So I know when I'm no longer here that my legacy will continue because my children and grandchildren will continue to tell my story. And I have a special favor to ask of all of you. I hope that you will be able to tell my story to those who have never heard me speak. I am a witness of history, and now that you have heard my story, you all are witnesses. So the people, I often think about the people that saved my life because they were so courageous, so generous. They were the true heroes. They risked their lives. They didn't have to do what they did. Their action didn't just save one life, they saved future generations. So this has made me realize the importance of the choices and decisions that we make. Because even the smallest acts of kindness have a ripple effect. So I urge every one of us to think about the kinds of decisions that we make. And I hope that we will speak out against any kind of injustice, because silence helps the aggressor. So let's all be upstanders and not bystanders. So with that, I will stop. I thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So Janet, I stopped sharing your presentation, if that's okay. And then we have quite a few questions.
Sure.
So some of the first that came in are asking, how did you acquire so many of your family's photos? What a precious keepsake.
So in those days, people did take a lot of photos. So some of the photos were saved by my grandfather, who survived in Siberia, and he returned. And some of the photos were sent to my uncle in Palestine, now Israel. And so that's how I have the photos. But I'd like to add something else. So in 2012, I was contacted by a young Polish historian who was doing her, studying for her PhD and studying the Holocaust. And she found me on the internet. And since that time, we have become very close. She has done a lot of research on my family. And for that reason, I have a lot of details of what happened to my family members.
Another question is, have you entered your testimony at, is it Vod Vashem? Am I
Yes,
saying that correctly?
I've been recorded by Shoah Foundation, and there's quite a few recordings of my story, including Yad Vashem.
So many questions about your pictures. Everyone loves them. Let's see. I think you already answered in your presentation, but would you just remind us how old you were when you came to the US and where you ended up when you first got to the US?
So I forgot a very important portion of my story. And that is that when we first came, I was almost 12 when we came. I turned 12 in June and we came in March. And but we had a very serious issue. We came on a 90-day visitor's visa. In 90 days, we had to leave, and we had another visa to go to Venezuela. The only way we could remain in this country is if my father married an American citizen. So the family looked around and they found him a wife. So I had a new stepmother, new name, new appearance, new friends, new language. Everything was new.
And then you also touched on this in your presentation, but there is a question about how you felt you were treated in the US. How was your experience when you first arrived?
I was very fortunate because I wasn't bullied or I wasn't teased, and I was accepted. And as I mentioned, there was a nice group of friends that really took care of me. So I was lucky. I came upon anti-Semitism later in life when I met a denier, which was a very painful experience talking to a person like that.
We also have some comments in. Wynn is saying, thank you so much for sharing your incredible story with us. And there are a few other comments like that. Thanking you so much for being with us tonight, Janet. We have several more questions if you're up for them.
Oh, sure. I might mention that I also have a website. So if you don't get a chance to ask me tonight, you can write to me, and it's Janet, www.janetapplefield.com.
Yes, and Janet also has a profile on the Facing History website, right, Janet?
Yes.
Facing History.
Right. And I'd like to mention that I have to get this in. My older son, David Applefield, is running for Congress from New Jersey, this District 4. So.
Wow, you must be so proud. Our marketing librarian is from New Jersey. I'll have to tell her.
Okay.
If given a seat at the table with the Polish president, how would you advise him to proceed with the rise of anti-Semitism in Poland? That was a question.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's a good question. I have to think for a second.
Not to interrupt you while you're thinking, but there was a related question asking if you have gone to Poland since.
Yeah. So that's an easier question. I'll go for the easier one first. Yes, I've been back to Poland 4 times. Each time the experience has been different. It's been, some of the trips were very difficult, but I met the family that saved me, and each time I've visited with them, and they're incredible people. And I've spoken in Poland, and at the church where I was abandoned, at the museum, at the town hall in my town. And what I found out in one of my last trips was that there's very small Jewish population in Poland today. There are some Jewish people, and those people, when they have children, they don't tell their children till they're 12 years old that they're Jewish, so it will allow them to make their own decision whether to reveal it or not. So the situation in Poland is pretty difficult right now. It's very conservative government, and it is there's racism and all kinds of religious bias. What would I tell the president? Hopefully that he should get educated and have some sensitivity training. I don't know what else to say about that.
So just a follow-up to the last question. What does Poland mean to you today?
There's a lot of pain there, thinking about it. I'm very close to the woman that I mentioned that has done so much research on my family. She's asking me to come and visit, and I probably will go back just to visit with her and her family. It's a difficult place to be. It's very painful, and it's very beautiful country. I mean, that the part that I'm from, mountains, it's just gorgeous. And of course, there are a lot of wonderful people there, so.
So there are several more questions. This one I think is really helpful for us, given everything that's happening in our world right now. So when you witness racism or hear racist comments, how have you responded?
Well, I have learned, because years ago I had a hard time responding. I would just get so scared knowing how to respond. But today I do respond, and I think it's important not to get emotional when you respond, so you don't have a fight or an argument with the other person. You hope to shed some light on their views. But it's not an easy thing to do, it's hard, but I do speak up today.
Excellent advice for us, Janet. Let's see, we have a few more questions. Were you forced to change your religion or practice another religion? And if so, how did that make you feel?
So during the war, I was Catholic. It's really even surprising to me that I was able to keep a secret, that I always knew I was Jewish. I always knew that, but I knew that I had to keep it a secret. So I was brought up Catholic. I was going to church. I had a first communion, and I was so little. I just did what I was told to do. I didn't have, obviously, I couldn't have full understanding of what was going on.
Oh, Janet, there are so many questions. Having resided in or near Krakow, did you have any friends or neighbors who were employed and saved by Schindler?
Who or what? I missed the last.
Who were employed or saved by Schindler?
Yes. As a matter of fact, a very, very good friend of mine, Rena Finder, she speaks also. She was one of Schindler's survivors. She and her mother survived.
Wow. We're also asking some personal questions, Janet. I don't think you'll mind answering them since you've been so open with us tonight. But have you coped with any lasting effects from being, a child in this situation, specifically PTSD?
I know that I have been affected. I never needed treatment for any psychiatric issues or psychological issues. But the fact that I had to be silent and not reveal my true identity, and it did have an effect on me as an adult, and an effect on me as in my marital relationship. Something that I had to work on to change and help myself. But luckily, now my father, on the other hand, had a lot of health issues, a very weak heart. And while growing up, I heard him, screaming in the middle of the night. He would have nightmares. And I know his health was compromised tremendously. And he died after an open heart surgery. He was just 73 years old.
Oh, thank you for sharing that with us, Janet. We do also have some questions about your parents. Somebody is wondering about what your family life was like with your stepmother and in America.
So when they got married, first of all, my father had to learn English, and I know he went to a lot of movies to learn. I learned in school, and I was fine. First he had a job in Macy's, New York, and then they bought a store, a hardware store. And they both worked in the store. They worked very hard. We lived above the store. We never could eat our meals together. They would take turns, going to the store, and there was a bell that they would ring if one of them was too busy in the store, the other person had to come down. So that's how I grew up with them. And but they had a pretty good marriage, and that was it.
So someone is asking, would you be able to share a few people that you've shared your story with, where you've told your story, maybe just where you've presented, I think is the question, or maybe what schools? I know this is all available